So what if I told you that the billions of dollars your company spends on all those mandatory training modules, the leadership seminars, the fancy offsite retreats,
Right.
what if all of that is actually what's driving workplace inequality? And that the real engine of your career, the thing that actually makes you good at your job, is basically completely invisible to human resources.
Yeah, I mean, it is a massive systemic miscalculation. The models that most organizations use to develop their talent are, well, they're based on assumptions that simply do not hold up.
Hmm.
Not when you look at the reality of how human beings actually absorb and apply information over a lifetime.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today, our mission for this deep dive is to completely blow up the traditional corporate idea of how you actually get better at your job.
And it needs to be blown up, honestly.
It really does. So we're looking at this brilliant synthesis by Dr. Jonathan H. Westover. And he unpacks this landmark 2024 empirical research by a team of economists, Ma and colleagues. And when I say they looked at data, I mean massive labor market data sets in Germany and the US.
Right, staggering amounts of data.
Yes.
And the overarching conclusion they reached is that companies are relying on this generic, one-size-fits-all approach to learning.
Right.
And it is just fundamentally flawed. It's structurally disconnected from the economic reality of human capital. But to understand why, we really have to look at how the researchers divided workplace learning into two very distinct categories.
Yeah, the sources divide everything into two buckets, basically. So the first is internal learning.
Yes.
And this is the informal, peer-to-peer, tacit knowledge. You absorb this just by existing around the people in your immediate organization. It's
Right.
like learning how to read a room because you just watched your manager diffuse a tense client meeting,
Right.
or knowing which department head actually holds the budget, or even just leaning over to ask the person next to you how to fix a stubborn spreadsheet formula.
Right. It's highly specific to your immediate environment.
Mm-hmm.
Then the second bucket is external learning. And this is the formal, structured material.
Like the official stuff.
Yeah, exactly. We are talking about external seminars, official certifications, coding boot camps, or structured courses provided from outside your firm.
Okay.
So internal learning is bounded by whoever happens to work right next to you.
Mm-hmm.
But external learning is essentially unlimited, because you are tapping into the broader societal pool of knowledge.
And the prevailing corporate mindset has always been this sort of shotgun approach, right? Like, just offer a mix of both to everyone all the time and hope they get smarter.
Yeah, just throw it all at the wall.
Right. But this 2024 data proves that your reliance on these two buckets shifts completely depending on your age and, where you are in your career life cycle.
It does. The data reveals two incredibly distinct trajectories. First, if we look at internal learning, that informal peer-to-peer absorption engagement declines in a straight monotonic line as you age.
Wait, really? A straight line down?
A straight line. For workers in their early 20s, their engagement in internal learning is at about 25%, meaning a massive quarter of their skill acquisition is just soaking up information from peers.
Oh, wow.
But as they approach retirement, that drops to under 10%.
I have to pause you there because that feels, I don't know, counterintuitive.
How so?
Well, wait, so you're telling me we just stop learning from our peers as we get older? Because I feel like I am always asking my team questions no matter how long I've been here.
It's not that you stop entirely, it just drops significantly.
Is it like, think about it like being a sponge in a kitchen.
Okay, I like this.
Right, so when you first start cooking, you learn just by watching your roommate chop an onion. You absorb everything because, holding a knife is brand new to you. But are you saying 10 years later, watching your roommate doesn't teach you anything new? So you have to actually pay for a culinary class. And that culinary class is the external learning.
That is a great analogy. What's fascinating here is that you have fundamentally changed your relationship to the knowledge frontier.
The knowledge frontier. Okay.
Right. When you are a 22-year-old operating in that kitchen,
Mm-hmm.
you are so far below the baseline knowledge frontier that literally every single interaction with an experienced peer is valuable. You're a sponge, like you said.
Right, because everything is new.
Exactly. But fast forward 10 years. You know how to chop the onion. You know where the good pans are hidden. You understand the quirks of the stove. You have essentially absorbed all the tacit knowledge that specific room has to offer.
Oh, I see. You hit the ceiling of what that specific environment can teach you organically.
Exactly. And that naturally introduces the second trajectory. Because external learning, those formal courses and seminars, it does not decline in a straight line. It follows an inverted U shape.
An inverted U shape. So it
Yeah.
goes up and then comes back down.
Precisely. At career entry, it starts surprisingly low, around 10 to 15% annually. Then it rises steadily, and it peaks in your 30s and 40s, reaching up to 20 or 25% before it tapers off near retirement.
Well, the low start makes sense mechanically, right? When you
Makes
are
sense.
22, you usually don't have the disposable income or, honestly, the time to pay for a specialized culinary class.
Right.
And frankly, why would you when your roommate is right there teaching you the basics for free?
Exactly. The economists refer to that as liquidity constraints and time poverty. Young workers simply cannot afford the external investment. Mid-career workers, however, they have the funds. And, more importantly, they've been working long enough to identify highly specific skill gaps.
Right, they know what they don't know.
Exactly. Plus, they still have enough career runway left, 20 or 30 years to actually see a financial return on taking a difficult, expensive external course. They need that formal culinary class because their internal kitchen has nothing left to offer them.
All right, so we have established this life cycle. The 20s are for soaking up the internal room, and the 30s and 40s are for reaching outside the building.
Right.
But the real question is, which of these actually matters more? If we are measuring lifetime success and the size of your paycheck, which bucket is doing the heavy lifting?
To answer that, the Mod L team ran some truly staggering counterfactual simulations.
So they basically ran a mathematical simulation of an alternate universe where one type of learning just, like, doesn't exist.
Yes, exactly. They wanted to isolate the actual impact of each learning type. And when they modeled a world without external training, average worker human capital, meaning their total skill level, dropped by about 6 to 7.0%.
Okay, so a decent drop.
But when they modeled a world where internal learning was eliminated, meaning no informal peer-to-peer knowledge transfer, total human capital dropped by 8.2 to 11.0%.
Wait, really?
Yes,
So internal learning contributes vastly more to your total lifetime skills than formal training.
it does. The simulation showed that internal learning contributes between 24% to 57% more to your total lifetime skill acquisition than external training.
That is insane.
It is the vastly more powerful engine of overall skill building.
Okay, so internal learning isn't just some nice-to-have cultural perk. It's essentially the dark matter of the workplace.
I like that. Dark matter.
Right, because it's totally invisible on a spreadsheet, but it's the gravitational force holding your entire skill set together. It's the mortar between the bricks of the house.
Oh, that's a highly accurate way to visualize it.
Yeah, you can go out and buy all the expensive, shiny bricks you want from Harvard or an online coding boot camp, and that's the external learning. But if you don't have the mortar, the daily invisible know-how of how things actually fit together inside your specific company, the house just falls down.
Exactly. The mortar is what makes the structure fundamentally sound.
But, okay, that leads me to a huge assumption. If the internal peer-to-peer stuff, the mortar, is what makes me significantly better at my job overall, then that should be what is driving the wage gap, right?
You would assume so?
Yeah, the people sitting next to the smartest peers, absorbing the best internal knowledge, should be the ones making the most money.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the data reveals a massive paradox. The opposite is actually true.
Wait, the opposite.
Yeah. Even though internal learning builds the vast majority of your baseline skills, it is external learning that acts as the great divider. External learning is what actually drives wage distortion and inequality across the broader market.
Okay, you have to explain that mechanism to me. Why am I getting paid disproportionately more for the bricks if the mortar is doing all the heavy lifting?
Because internal learning only helps you catch up to the baseline of the people around you. Think about it. If you learn everything your manager knows, you have only reached the current ceiling of your organization. You haven't added net new knowledge to the company. You were just matching the baseline. External learning, however, allows you to leapfrog.
Ah, okay, I see.
Yeah, when you take that external course in your late 30s, you are pulling in highly specialized, cutting-edge knowledge from the broader industry frontier, and you're bringing it back to your desk.
Which makes you uniquely valuable.
Exactly. If we ran a simulation without external learning, we would see wage compression. Everyone's skills would just eventually plateau at the exact same level of whatever their company already knew. But when you introduce external training, the specific workers who get access to it accumulate unique human capital faster.
And their wages pull away from the rest of the pack.
Precisely.
Which brings us to a really uncomfortable reality about the modern workplace.
It does.
We now know that internal learning builds this massive invisible foundation early on, and we know it requires physical or at least highly synchronous proximity to skilled peers to work. So what happens when you physically remove the people you're supposed to be learning from? I'm thinking specifically about remote work, especially for a 22-year-old taking their very first job from a laptop in their childhood bedroom.
The data on this is highly concerning. The researchers describe a severe path dependence penalty.
Path dependence meaning the start of your journey locks in your destination.
Exactly. If an early career worker misses out on that crucial initial window of internal learning, whether that is because they are placed on a small isolated team or they are fully remote, or even due to workplace discrimination, where peers just don't share knowledge with them, they never fully recover.
Never. Come on. Like, even if they realize they are behind at age 28 and take a bunch of rigorous external courses to make up for it.
The modeling indicates they really cannot just make it up later. And the mechanics of why this happens are cold, but they are economically logical.
How so?
Well, if you miss that early sponge phase, you fail to build the foundational mortar.
Yeah.
Because you lack those baseline skills, your productivity is lower. Because your productivity is lower, your wages and promotions stall.
Oh, man.
Right. And because your wages are lower, your future budget, both in time and money, for taking those external courses in your 30s is severely constrained. It creates a compounding, cumulative disadvantage. You are starved to the foundation, so you can never afford the leapfrog.
That casts a really long, dark shadow over the COVID-19 pandemic. We had an entire generation of younger workers forced into absolute physical isolation during their most formative professional years.
Yes. The macroeconomic scars from that period are going to be long-lasting. Those younger workers may experience permanently lower earnings trajectories, specifically because that initial organic window of internal learning was structurally disrupted.
Because they couldn't just lean over and ask a question.
Exactly. The casual, spontaneous knowledge transfer, overhearing a senior colleague solve a problem on a phone call, it was entirely cut off.
All right, so the early career workers are facing a structural crisis if they are isolated, but what about the mid-career folks? Because something you said earlier really stuck with me.
What was that?
You said mid-career workers hit the ceiling of their specific kitchen. Is this why so many people hit their late 30s or early 40s and just feel, profoundly stuck?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, they are doing their jobs well, they might even be taking some corporate training modules, but the day-to-day thrill is completely gone.
The data confirms that this subjective feeling of boredom is a real, measurable economic phenomenon. Economists call it an experiential plateau.
An experiential plateau, meaning the actual experience of doing the work stops providing any new stimulation.
Exactly. Remember, internal learning declines as you age because you stop encountering colleagues with significantly higher or vastly different skills in your immediate daily orbit.
You already know what everyone else knows.
Right. The daily aha moments completely dry up. The psychology here is fascinating, honestly. Your brain begins to categorize your daily tasks as routine rote mechanics rather than active problem solving.
So you're just on autopilot.
Yes. So your day-to-day work becomes fundamentally less salient, less engaging. Even if you are taking a formal external course at night, the 8 hours you spend at your desk feels stagnant because that internal learning engine, which used to fire constantly when you were 25, has basically shut down.
Okay, so if we zoom out, the picture we have painted is incredibly challenging. Early career workers are getting starved of the mortar they need to build their foundation, and mid-career workers are bored to tears because they have absorbed everything their immediate environment has to offer.
It sounds bleak, I know, but this is exactly where the sources transition from diagnosis to application.
Right. And
Yeah.
here's where it gets really interesting, because the smartest, most adaptive organizations in the world aren't just ignoring this data. They are actively engineering their physical and structural environments to match the economic reality of how learning actually happens.
Exactly.
So let's look at the early career stage first, which we know needs a massive, immediate injection of internal learning. The sources highlight Deloitte and Goldman Sachs. What are they doing differently?
They are heavily engineering density. Deloitte, for example, built Deloitte University. They don't just hire recent graduates and trickle them into isolated remote teams across the country.
Okay.
They bring them together physically in cohort-based onboarding. They are designing physical architecture and schedules that force collisions between novices and experts, creating incredibly dense, overlapping peer networks right out of the gate.
In Goldman Sachs.
Goldman does something similar, but at the team structure level. They purposefully assign entry-level analysts to small, incredibly skill-diverse deal teams. So a brand new 22-year-old analyst isn't just working with other 22-year-olds.
Who wouldn't have anything to teach them anyway?
Right. Instead, they are placed directly on a team with a slightly older associate, a seasoned vice president, and a highly experienced managing director. They are actively maximizing the internal learning surface area for that young worker by forcing proximity to the absolute top of the knowledge frontier.
But, I mean, what about companies trying to balance this with the reality of remote work? Because we really cannot put that genie back in the bottle. People want to work from home, and companies want the overhead savings. How do you build mortar over Zoom?
You usually don't, which is why Shopify's approach is such a brilliant compromise. During the pandemic, Shopify announced a digital by default policy, letting the vast majority of their workforce go fully remote.
Right, I remember that.
But they recognized the path dependence penalty we talked about earlier. So they specifically mandated in-person pods for their first-year developers.
So they basically quarantined the early learning phase.
Essentially, yes. For their first 12 months, these new hires were required to work on site a few days a week. But here is the critical part. They didn't just leave the junior developers in an empty office. Senior engineers were specifically scheduled to rotate through these pods.
Oh, that's smart.
Shopify violently protected that initial sponge phase, ensuring the foundation was laid, and then and only then allowed those workers to transition to fully remote work.
That makes total sense. You protect the most vulnerable phase of skill acquisition. But let's pivot to the other end of the spectrum. What about the mid-career folks who have hit that experiential plateau? How are companies fixing the stagnation problem?
This is where strategic external learning becomes vital. Think back to the inverted U-shaped mid-career, is when external learning naturally peaks. AT&T recognized this massive shift when they launched their Workforce 2020 initiative. They realized they needed to reskill roughly 100,000 workers due to rapid shifts in cloud computing and data science.
But isn't AT&T just throwing money at an external solution because their internal culture stagnated? How is that different from the generic corporate playbook?
It is different because it was highly targeted. Instead of just spraying generic training dollars equally across all employees, they intentionally concentrated their full tuition reimbursement programs, funding things like Udacity courses and Georgia Tech nano degrees, heavily on their mid-career talent.
Ah, I see.
They looked at the data and realized this specific demographic had the highest application rates for external knowledge and the clearest structural need to leapfrog to the new industry frontier. They subsidized the external bricks for the exact people who had already maximized their internal mortar.
Right, I follow that, but I have to push back on a major friction point regarding the early career strategy.
Sure, what is it?
Well, you mentioned Goldman Sachs putting a managing director on a team with a 22-year-old. How do you actually convince a senior employee who is compensated based on their incredibly lucrative high-level output to stop doing their job just to teach a junior employee how the corporate plumbing works?
It is a phenomenal question, and honestly, it is the single biggest failure point for most companies. The source data is extremely clear here. If you rely solely on the goodness of people's hearts or vague concepts of mentorship, it fails.
Naturally.
To make this work, companies must make teaching an explicit, heavily weighted performance evaluation metric. You have to tie the transfer of tacit knowledge directly to the senior employee's promotions and compensation.
So you literally pay them to be the mortar.
Yes. But furthermore, organizations that do this successfully leverage something psychologists call the protege effect.
The protege effect, what is that?
It is a cognitive phenomenon where the act of teaching someone else actually deepens and rewires the mentor's own understanding of a subject.
Wait, really?
When a 40-year-old vice president has to stop and explain a highly intuitive, unspoken process to a 22-year-old, they are forced to articulate their tacit knowledge. They had to explicitly categorize their own behaviors.
Oh, wow. So by forcing them to teach, you are actually pulling the senior worker out of their own experiential plateau.
Precisely. You are breaking their brain out of its routine. By formalizing these teaching roles, companies give senior workers a cognitive reset, keeping them engaged while simultaneously transferring vital knowledge to the junior staff.
That is incredible. And the sources also point out that modern knowledge management systems can actually bridge the gap between these two phases. The Pixar University example really stands out here.
Oh, yes, that's a great example.
They didn't just offer external formal classes to their animators, they designed the digital interface of their course catalog to include social features. So if I'm an animator at Pixar, I can log in and see exactly what external seminars my peers are currently studying.
Right, which completely changes the dynamic of the office. It sparks informal, peer-to-peer, water cooler conversations about formal, external training.
Exactly.
By making external learning visible, they are actively forcing the two trajectories to collide. It is a phenomenal example of recognizing that learning is fundamentally a social, life cycle dependent process rather than just, a sterile content delivery problem.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? We have covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have.
We've looked at the invisible foundational power of internal learning. We've explored the wage-driving leapfrog effect of external training. And we've seen the very real compounding dangers of getting stuck in an isolated remote work silo early in your journey.
Yes.
If you are early in your career, the tactical takeaway is undeniable. You need to aggressively seek out the smartest people in the room. Fight for high-density, in-person projects. Be the sponge. Do not let the comfort of a remote setup rob you of the foundational mortar you need to build your career.
And conversely, if you are in your mid-career and you are feeling deeply stuck, recognize that this is a structural reality. Your internal learning curve has flattened. Your brain has plateaued.
Which is normal.
Very normal. This is exactly the moment you need to advocate for external learning. Ask your boss to fund a specific certification, attend an industry-leading seminar, or actively seek out a role where you are forced to mentor junior staff so you can trigger the protege effect and reset your own knowledge frontier.
You absolutely have to change your strategy as you age. But before we wrap up, there is one final, lingering piece of this puzzle that I just cannot stop thinking about.
What's that?
If this massive data set proves, unequivocally, that internal peer-to-peer learning contributes vastly more to your lifetime human capital, to your actual functional skills than formal training does, why does the modern labor market only credentials external learning?
Oh, that is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It points to a massive structural failure in how we signal value in the economy.
Where you can put a master's degree or an 18-TU Udacity certificate right at the top of your resume. The hiring algorithms will instantly flag it, recruiters will praise it, and it will be used to justify a significantly higher salary.
But there's absolutely no formal, universally accepted way to document on a resume, I absorbed 10 years of highly complex, invisible, tacit knowledge from brilliant peers at a high-functioning company.
Exactly. How do you prove your mortar? You can't. And that creates this bizarre, almost dystopian reality where the true engine of your career, the 8 to 11% of foundational human capital you gain organically, is completely invisible to the broader market when you try to change jobs.
It really forces us to reconsider what we are actually evaluating when we look at a candidate's history. Are we measuring their true functional capacity, or are we just measuring their visible paperwork?
How will the future of hiring adapt to measure the invisible? Will we start credentialing the specific teams we worked on rather than the courses we took? Will the density of the network you built become an actual measurable metric in hiring algorithms?
It's going to have to, eventually.
It is something you really have to wonder about as you navigate your own path and decide where to invest your time. We want to thank you for joining us today as we navigated the hidden architecture of human capital. Keep seeking out that mortar, keep pushing your knowledge frontier, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.